Tremendous buzz in the hall. Never had such difficulty in calling for silence. Must be a hugely popular speaker, which I'm not surprised, because she deserves the John Cornforth Memorial of Honor, Medal of Honor. Indeed, we must probably design one for her, because 3 weeks ago, she was doing something quite different and was intending to go to the dinner before her husband's vernissage, who's a painter, this evening. And when I telephoned out of the blue with the advice of Norman Hudson and others who knew Sarah, she said, give me 10 minutes. It was such a relief, because I didn't know what we were going to do at 3 weeks' notice. And then the other worry, of course, was that the Duchess's fans might fall away. But we needn't worry about that, because Sarah has a lot of friends here, she's already told me, who she hasn't seen for years. So her name has conjured up, has made the difference. And it was sad about Eleanor Argyle, but her stepmother had died, and she has to have a little operation. Combermere has a long and fascinating history, and Sarah will tell us that story. But I'd just like to say a few words about her. She had a successful career in PR and marketing, first in London, and then for 15 years in New York as North American PR director for Laura Ashley. She then returned to London in 1990 to take up an international role for Laura Ashley. Is that right?
Yes.
I had a voice off. In 1992, she inherited Combermere from her mother, and since then, she has developed the estate as a focus of heritage and tourism business, and has become an active champion of heritage and tourism business in Cheshire. She's a director of marketing Cheshire and chairs the Rural Strategy Group for Cheshire. She was the first female director of the CLA, and until recently was on the board of Historic Houses. On top of all that, she's been High Sheriff of Cheshire in 2017 and is a Deputy Lieutenant. So we're incredibly lucky and very grateful to have her here to speak to us this evening. Sarah Callender Beckett.
Well, I have to say, I'm very honoured to be here in front of such an august group of people, many whom will know a lot more about historic properties than I do. But I also am absolutely shocked to see how many people have come out of the woodwork, which has made this evening even more special. People I haven't seen for 30 years, people I've worked on the restoration with, who suddenly came up and said, hello, how are you? People we've met whose families have had relationships with Combermere. It's wonderful, absolutely wonderful. I'm going to sort of canter through the earlier history and elaborate more on the later part of Combermere's story, as well as our 30-year restoration. It's got 900 years of history. It was a monastic estate and then has been privately owned by 2 families. And probably its true value has been more about its social history and impact on the area in which it sits, rather than having and owning huge collections of art and antiques. I think it's remarkable that it's still standing at all, as you will hear and see. It survived fire, kidnap, and murder during its first life as a Cistercian abbey, founded in 1133, and finally put into financial measures due to the inept management of its abbot. After the dissolution in 1538, it was a 22,000-acre estate, and the abbey buildings and estate were gifted to the Cotton family, whose tenure lasted almost 400 years and was then put again in financial measures as a result of living above their means and gambling debts. And they rented the house out to pay the bills. And it was finally sold in 1919 to the new owner, who was my great-grandfather, Kenneth Crossley. And we'll elaborate on that a bit later. They always say a picture says 1,000 words, so I'd like to run a short video for you. It was created thanks to the Cultural Recovery Fund, and it gives you a strong introduction to this jewel of an estate.
Welcome to Combermere Abbey. This historic house set in 1,000 acres of Cheshire's ancient woodlands, walled gardens and rural parkland. Over the last 900 years, the building on this site has changed a great deal. Cumbermere's origins lie in a substantial Cistercian monastery, founded in the 1100s and home to a community of monks. After the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII, the abbey was gifted to Sir George Cotton, who removed some of the monastic buildings from the site and incorporated the existing Abbot's Hall into a Tudor manor house. And it's part of that original building that forms part of the main house today. Over the following centuries, Sir George's descendants made a range of changes to the site, adding a stable block, a grand ballroom, a fine clock tower, a stone lodge, and various outbuildings across the site. And between 1814 and 1820, the house was remodelled in the popular Gothic style by the first Viscount Cumbermere. It's to him that we owe the recognisable outline of the building's roof. The abbey and estate remained in Cotton family hands right up until 1919, when they were sold to Sir Kenneth Crossley of Crossley Motors, Manchester. The building was used as a school for evacuated girls during the Second World War, and the house began to show signs of increasing decay. In 1957, the estate passed to Sir Kenneth's granddaughter, Lady Lindsay, and renovation works took place to shore up parts of the house. Sir Kenneth's great-granddaughter, Sarah Callender Beckett, takes up the story.
My mother inherited this property from her grandfather, and she didn't have a son. We're three girls, and so out of the blue in the late 80s, I got the call up from my mum, who said, would you be interested? I was the oldest. And I thought about it for about a year. I came back, I took stock of what was here. I recognized that the place had sort of gone to sleep. The buildings needed a lot of work. The energy was very depleted. And the location, the landscape, the environment here, the place the house sits in, really needed that energy. And so I decided to say yes, and here I am.
Renovating a site on this scale is no small project. Since the early 1990s, Sarah and her family have been working almost continually on the preservation and renovations of Cumbermere. This vast restoration project has focused on the key listed buildings at the site, beginning with the stable block, which was carefully refurbished and converted into self-catering accommodation.
This is a very special place, and it's got 900 plus years of history attached to it. So you bring people in whose work you respect, and the building needs that respect. And it's not a DIY job, and you go down to B&Q and you pick out your product and come home and you go online and decide, well, that's how you should do the job. You're looking at people who have dedicated years of time and years of hands-on experience, as well as craftsmanship and learning.
Professional conservators were brought in to work on the project. A range of heritage skills and specialisms were needed to bring the vision to life. Following work on the stable block, the team focused on the walled gardens and Edwardian glasshouse, the game larder, the clock tower, and, of course, the abbey itself, restoring the historic library and completely refurbishing the north wing in 2014.
When I see Cumbermere now, I see somewhere which is much more energetic, and I find that response from the people that I interact with who come back here now, either on a tour of the house, to stay at the holiday cottages, to get married here, to be involved in one of the businesses that we've put into the restored buildings. And their reaction just enhances and re-enhances the positive energy that I'd always hoped to achieve. So I'm really proud of the fact that we now have an environment here that they really want to be part of, which was lacking, wasn't there before.
Cumbermere is a place that's been shaped by its various residents and owners over the years, clergy, gentry, and now in family hands. Each generation leaves their mark on this special place. The most recent of which is the careful restoration of the site's buildings, bringing Cumbermere back into full use and giving it a sense of purpose for the modern world.
Well, that does give you a wonderful overview, some of which you'll hear me talk about a bit again. But 30 years ago, the very concept of inheriting a country estate had a rather solid traditional ring to it, and very much tied in with the domain of male primogenitors. I'm glad to say that's changed remarkably in 30 years. But when I look back on the decision to come back, I could have been called naive. I've also been called crazy, mad, and many other adjectives as well. But I had an amazing experience in America. I had 15 years working in the corporate world and in business. And I am a glass half full person. And so I reckoned I was really up for the challenge. I found out in America that if you set your heart at doing something and you worked hard, you could get there. It wasn't something that I'd grown up with particularly, but I certainly developed that experience. So initially I thought, well, that's fine. I'll keep my job and I'll come back to England once a month on the plane, like I used to do for business. And that's fine. I'll run and manage the estate, and then I'll pop back and do my job. Well, I was wrong. Very quickly, I was wrong. And so I exchanged my high heels for Wellington boots. I would say Cumbermere, as you've just seen, was on the endangered species list. It was actually teetering on the edge of extinction at the time and seriously needed that energy. I had plenty of energy, but of course it also needed cash, which I had rather less of at the time. We had challenges. One of the biggest challenges was that Cumbermere had no archives. Through the years, the families that had lived there hadn't kept archives in one place. So there was nothing in the house at all. And I think that what I see is that the way we've been able to cover this restoration over the 30 years I've been there, it's actually formed a new archive for us. And that is probably one of the most valuable things. And in the digital world, it's very well documented now. The Cotton family created a very strong legacy. They were respected, they were successful, they enlarged the Tudor manor house, as you've seen, married into very established families with dowries to match. That was always very lucky. And they were really responsible for the changes to create the house that you see today. But that was the nub of the problem, because the house that you see today is really 3 houses. It's 3 buildings. So here we have a picture of part of the monastic structure which still lives in the house. This is the hammer beam roof of the abbot's lodge of the monastery. And then when they changed it, and here's some more of that roof, and that still remains today. The Tillermans photo, which I'm going to come back to, is absolutely invaluable to us. And luckily, my great-grandfather bought this painting in the sale in 1919. And if we didn't have that, we wouldn't have this record. And work we have done has actually absolutely matched the Gothic, timber frame structure that you see. And I'll go back to talk about that later. And now, of course, you see it as the Gothic structure that Lord Cumbermere wanted to create in 1820. I'm going to go back to the Tillermans painting. What you see is 2 lakes. Today we have 1 lake. You also see a whole range of gardens that approach the house. Well, those now form part of the existing lake. And if you can think in late 1700s, they would have dug that all out by hand. There were no diggers or anything to dig it out. And when we do projects with local metal detectors. We're always finding the most extraordinary things where you would have had buildings which have now got water. This painting that I showed you joined the two meres. The landscape was then, the park was then landscaped by William Eames, who was part of that group of Capability Brown and a whole group of people actually. And he worked in Cheshire at the time. Now, the best known owner of Combermere and the Cotton family was definitely Sir Stapleton Cotton, who became first Viscount. He was born in 1773. He died aged 91. A very renowned military commander as a general under Wellington, and had a very established diplomatic career in Barbados and Ireland and India. He married 3 times. His last wife was 30 years younger than him, but very importantly, she was an heiress. So she refilled the coffers once more. And he basically was responsible for consolidating the Gothic architecture. Here we have him again. He extended the front hall, and that was full of his army memorabilia, his campaign memorabilia, including 2 very large guns at the front. He created an entirely new drive and a lodge at the top of the drive, which has been restored. And then he built the 1837 stables, which you saw in the film, which were designed by Edward Blore. And they housed 36 horses, as well as the carriages and the grooms and everybody else. The other amazing thing we were able to have as a painting to support his contribution to the house was this picture here. Now, this picture also just survived. Most things at Combermere seem to have just survived. It was painted by Patrick Heafy, and it was commissioned by Lord Combermere for a dining room he built on to celebrate the visit of the boss. So we all know what we do for bosses. You know, it's known as Brown knows the boss, but not many people have done what he did. So he had this painting, which really celebrates his entire military career. It's actually on the background of Barrackpore, which was a huge battle that he won for Wellington. Wellington got too tired of traveling and said, okay, Combermere, off you go, you can do the job for me instead. It sat above a fireplace in this dining room. And actually, the interesting thing is he's surrounded by obviously all the other people that he used to fight with. And the gentleman in the middle with the top hat is called Colonel Pickering. And Colonel Pickering was, in fact, a full army colonel and never went into battle in anything but dressed like that. But he had a really important role. His role was he was the battle auditor. And the battle auditor was really vital because the battle auditor found out who died on both sides of the battle. And according to how many of the enemy people had died, he totted it up, and the winning side got their bounty. So he was really important. But the interesting thing about that is when that was painted, he was dead, actually. But so he was put in to reflect his relationship with Lord Combermere. So we know that it isn't completely true in terms of the fact it was Barrackpore, but it is a wonderful painting. Now, that painting was covered in grey mould because the north wing was, the Wellington wing was built very quickly, was very cold because it was north facing, and the painting had got this sort of grey sort of mould all over it. And when they pulled the Wellington wing down in 1974, my mother was about to throw this painting on the skip. And her friend said, why don't we just clean a bit of it and see if anything interesting is underneath? And that's what was underneath. So we are really lucky that we have that painting, because it could have ended up in a skip, which would not have been so happy. Anyway, after the first Viscount's death, it went downhill very quickly. 2 generations later, the estate was heavily mortgaged, and there was a disastrous part sale in 1893 when they couldn't sell the house and 5,000 acres, but they sold everything else because the agent didn't stop the sale. And so after that, the house was rented out. And one of the relatives of one of the families is here tonight. And so we had quite a few illustrious and very wealthy people who paid rent. Probably the most well-known was the Empress of Austria, who came to Combermere to hunt it with the Cheshire and the Wednesday hunts for 2 years. She arrived, she put in a telephone system so she could call her husband, tell him she was all right. She only came to Combermere because of the number of stables we had. She bought 17 horses with her from Austria, and she bought another 15. She hunted every single day of the week that she was permitted to, and probably had 2 horses out every day. She was sewn into her habit by the local tailor from Whitchurch, who came out with his horse and carriage. And she was also bulimic. So she didn't have the smart bedrooms in the house. She took over a whole floor of the servants' wings. So she and her ladies lived there because she could quietly and secretly go downstairs to the kitchen and eat at night when nobody else could see her, because she never ate a thing during the day in front of anybody else. I mean, it was really extraordinary. Anyway, she came and she spent time at Combermere as well. The other thing we're really well known for is our ghost. Oh, where are we going for? Yeah? Ghost, the famous ghost. Now, this is probably, we have actually got a couple of ghosts. Actually, we've got more than a couple of ghosts. Some of them have already left because I did I had a cleaning out process. But this ghost is in this painting, and it's one of the best known ghost paintings viewed across the world. And it was taken by a woman called Sybil Corbett, who was the sister-in-law of the second Viscount's wife. She took it when he was actually, he just died, and he was being buried in Wrenbury Church. And she put it on open exposure, and when she developed it, there he was, sitting in the chair. So you can think of what you want, but we like the idea we've got ghosts. The other ghost we've got is a monk. That monk was last physically seen by my great-grandfather, walking down a set of stairs in what was his office, which is now called our smoking room. And what we've discovered many, many years later is that there is a door in the room next to the smoking room, which has been obviously blocked up. But when the last Viscount was visiting Combermere as a young man with his brothers, that door was open and it led down to the crypt where there were a load of sarcophagi. And we had all sorts of wonderful stories. But my great-grandfather obviously made him rather nervous, so he blocked the door up. And I have to say that is one door I'm not really interested in opening. Anyway, then we move on to our family, the Crossley family. Now, the Crossley family my great-grandfather, Kenneth, was second generation chairman of Crossley Motors. And I suppose what I've always said, it's like after the war, it was like purchasing a trophy estate. It was a small estate. Well, it wasn't that small, but it was a small estate, and it was close to his factories in Manchester. He learnt to fly at about the age of 45, and he used to fly from Combermere to the factories. He made beautiful cars, one of which I have, and he made them, and the car business, it stayed in business until 1957, and sadly, it was closed. Too much competition from the Americans, I think. And he married, lucky for him again, an American heiress. My great-grandmother, Josephine, She was a field from Chicago, and that's her and my grandfather. Now, my grandfather, sadly, died 2 weeks before World War II. And the second sadness that Grandpa and Great Granny had was that my uncle, Francis, died of polio in 1953. And that is why it's gone to the female line. My mother then inherited it in 1959, and I took it on from her in 1992. The other thing, Cumbermere is a story of survival. It survived the threat of total demolition. Not once, but twice. It was almost demolished and rebuilt by the first Viscount, but the bank went broke and he lost most of his money. So that's when he encapsulated the Tudor building in the Gothic frame. And then my mother had a plan to demolish it and to rebuild a rather beautiful, that's my mother, sorry, house by Raymond Erith. But that unfortunately never got built either because it was just a step too far financially. But it would have incorporated the main room, the library, and then built a very contemporary house. So down to my tenure, 30 years ago. Where did I begin? I had a big party. Some people here may have come to that party. And then I planted some trees in the park, which sadly hadn't had trees planted for a long time. Then I met my husband, Peter, and we got married about a year later. And then we got down to the serious stuff. So we created our vision, which was to evolve and not to evolution rather than revolution. But the most important thing is it had to meet all the key players. And the key players were English Heritage, to discuss money. The planners, they told me, don't come forward with an idea for a golf course. We have too many applications for golf courses already. And then chat up the bank. It was a real learning curve. It was pre-email and internet area, which most of us will have forgotten. Thank goodness for bank managers you could talk to face to face. English Heritage still had money to give away, and planners who weren't tied up by too much red tape, which they now are. So we launched forward. What were the challenges? Well, interestingly, one of the first challenges was introducing new ideas, new ways of working, new businesses, and a change of culture to an estate that had been completely traditional and very private, never opened to the public unless it was a friend of a friend who wanted a dinner or the local fete. It was scary for people who'd been living there. We then had to identify all the issues. So I appointed architects who arrived on a tandem. I thought that was rather fun when they were interviewing with me. We did a quinquennial review, which was supposed to outline the problems in every one of the listed buildings. There were 7 of them, and what the scale of the problem was. So learned very quickly how to prioritize. So we had to repair a building that could become a business. There was no question of putting the money into the house because there was never any money. We would never make money back. So we started with the stable block. So this is the stable block in about 1890. And those are the 2 cottages which the grooms lived in. That was the stable block when I appeared, which you saw pictures of. And so really every roof was derelict. And the only roof that wasn't, they'd had rebuilt because of a hurricane in 1984. And so we went from there to this. It was an interesting journey. It was 8 months late. Only 2/3 of it was built when I had the first guest arrive. He was interesting. He and his mother came from Scotland and spent every day at Cadbury's World. I don't know what their car boot looked like when they went back home, but every day he went down to Cadbury's World. Anyway, it now has 9 holiday cottages and sleeps 49 people. So we gave this a new life, and it has paid its way since. That's one of the insides of the building now, one of the cottages. It was designer-led. I was very lucky. I'd worked in design all my life, and each cottage I was supported by a well-known British interior designer to come and help me. And it made all the difference because it gave me a very strong PR handle to go out and get some free PR from. So instead of being full of horses that the estate would have had to pay for, now it's full of guests who pay to come and stay with me, which I'm really pleased about. And this is the back garden of some of the cottages there. They've all been given little gardens. Then we moved on to the walled gardens. There are 3 walled gardens over 6 acres. So we started with a garden that would actually be able to be used by the holiday cottage people. But here we have an idea of the top garden. And unfortunately, actually, I should have had a photo before this one was taken because we had 56 self-seeded sycamores in this garden, many of which were going through the side wings and the middle of the glass house. So we were unable to save the 2 side wings completely. And we only kept the structure of the glass house because we thought, well, actually, we'll do something with it at some point. So now it looks like that. So the first garden nearest this picture is where we sort of called the amenity garden for the holiday cottage people before we did weddings. The middle garden is where you see where the holiday cottage guests have their receptions, their parties. And the top is where we put in a wonderful fruit tree maze designed by Randall Coate in 1992, without any idea what we were actually going to end up with a wedding venue there. But we thought it was fun, and I wanted a maze, so there we are. And that is the maze in situ and the glass house waiting to be done. And that's the glass house when it was completed, with the maze in blossom, and it was all fruit and the crabapple trees. Now, grants have been a vital lifeline to Cumbermere, whether it was English Heritage Grants or other organisations, which I could not promote more highly. We were introduced to Country Houses Foundation at that point. And Country Houses Foundation, under the illustrious arm of Norman Hudson, who's here tonight, was the easiest, least problematic way of getting a grant to restore important buildings not in the main house. So we started with the game larder, which looked like that. And thanks to Country Houses Foundation, which is now called the Historic Houses Foundation, it became that. And there was no questions. They just believed in us. They gave us the cash, and we spent it. And that's what it looks like today. And it's on our tour, which is even better. Then we moved to the clock tower, which is in a similar range of buildings. That had an amazing clock with, actually, it's got Gothic numerals and not Roman numerals. And during the restoration of this building, we discovered that it actually was a victory clock tower, one of many that were put up in 1815 after we won the Battle of Waterloo. And it was carved into the stone at the top, the date and the initials of the builder. So we actually have that as provenance. And so after it was finished, that's what it looked like. It's now our estate office. So we get to probably the most complicated of all the projects. And you saw some of the outline there with the video. But the first phase was when I got a call up, and the architects have been doing a bit of a look-see around the main house and told us that the roof of the library was about to collapse. And so we beetled back to English Heritage, and we were very fortunate. They were 100% supportive the whole way along. So here you see, as you did in that picture, the library in about 1890. Actually, it was a bit later than 1890. because when my great-grandfather bought the house, they sold all the books, 3,000 books were sold, and he didn't particularly have 3,000 books to put in their place, but my great-grandmother was a pianist and an organist, and he therefore recreated the whole of that area that would have had bookshelves as for her organ. So we actually have space for an organ. The organ now sits in, I found it, it's in Yorkshire. It was an American organ that she had built specially and brought over. So we went from the roof structure, which I haven't got photographs of that, but that was quite a project. And that's where we first had to take off the front of the house to understand what was behind it. And the timber frame structure married the timber frame structure in the picture of the Tillemans painting. So we absolutely knew the Tillemans painting was a proper record of what the house looked like, which was fantastic. So the second one was the fireplace wall. And when that was the other most interesting thing. So the fireplace wall, after we'd done the roof, then we came back to do the fireplace wall because that was beginning to fall apart. And when we took all the paneling off, we discovered there was another fireplace underneath. The earlier Tudor fireplace was huge. And that is the scale of the earlier Tudor fireplace. And the smaller fireplace was put in by Lord Combermere when he decided to decorate the library. And that's when he painted the ceiling and put on all the shields representing all of his family marriages. And that fireplace there, which we had to restore completely. And we sent a little chap up there, very old-fashioned, to reline it. It's just like sending an old chimney sweep up. But he had to go up the top, reline it, come down again. It's fascinating. Anyway, so that is now what the room looks like restored, including the paintings, which were sent away to the conservation office in Liverpool. And I suppose the most exciting thing about having a house like this is finding bits that suit it. And so that's happened all the way through. They're not the original bits. Some of them are. We have found things for the north wing, which were originally in the house. But just finding items that naturally fit in and make the house look as it should be. And that, of course, this is the key room on our tours. And then we go to the north wing. Oh my goodness. This was our major challenge. We spent 13 years getting approval with 2 enabling development applications to fund this project. And English Heritage bought us some scaffolding, which was up there for almost 20 years. And that was there to stop the roof falling in. Because if the roof had fallen in, it would have been a very different story. And you can see a big hole there. Yeah. And when I first came back to Combermere, I was walking around the North Wing with a wonderful guy who used to do all sorts of things for us, sort of maintenance, handyman, everything. And I said, "Oh gosh, this window looks like it's a bit unsafe. Shall we put something against it to keep it in?" And he said, "Yes, yes, yes." He rushed off, got a piece of wood. As we were putting the wood to stabilize the window, the entire wall fell out. So, and it stayed like that for another 23 years before we started the project. However, I'll now show you a few of the pictures which indicate just how awful it had become. And the awfulness had become like that because it was 2 houses. It was the Tudor house covered by a Gothic facade, with a large hole in the middle, hadn't been built very well, and started to fail. All the lead had been taken off the roof and the wall and not been put back properly. And so we were really facing a challenge. So here you see before what is now a lovely bedroom people can stay in. That was my uncle's bedroom. Most of that wall had fallen out too, and we saved as much paneling as we could. That was my grandmother's bedroom, and that's what it looks like today. And that is this drawing room, which was her sitting room. And that's what it looks like today. So we really were up against it, because if we hadn't got the money finally, then actually I think the house probably would have collapsed. We had about one more winter to go. So it's now complete. And I would simply say that it's been a remarkable journey for a number of different reasons. One is it has brought together, or brought out of the woodwork, the most wonderful people the whole way along the journey from it over the whole 30 years who've worked alongside us. We've found the most incredible craftsmen. We've found people that have given us things and given us pictures of the house from many years ago. So we've been able to build a better picture. We've found people that have volunteered their time. Somebody on a tour volunteered to do an entire heraldic review of the shields in the library, something I would have had to spend thousands on, and we still have it today. So these things, these sorts of journeys, they test you. You have to be rather resilient. But on the other hand, they do renew your belief in human nature. They really do. And now today, all I can say is it's still here. And we've developed businesses. So we still are a farm. We have an organic farm. We still run a tourism. We now run the tourism hospitality business, and we now do about 100 weddings a year in the walled gardens. So we don't have them in the house anymore. And, and we have an award-winning distillery, so I can go and get a gin and tonic whenever I want. And we open for tours. And people come out of the woodwork on our tours. We've had people that were there at school in the war who come back to see us. We have people, had relatives. We've had Americans coming who have 20 generations ago, somebody that worked, and did I know them? And the answer is no, I didn't. And but it's always great, and it's wonderful, and it's an everlasting journey, and it will just keep going, I'm sure. And thank you very much for listening.
Wonderful, uplifting story would have prompted questions. We've got a bit of time, but probably not as long as usual, because you must get back to your...
Oh, I'm so sorry, did I?
No, far from that.
I don't have to get back anywhere. I'm going
don't.
for a gin and tonic and dinner.
Nevertheless, so questions from anyone. There's a microphone coming to anyone who wants to ask one.
I think I've got this thing here attached to me.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely terrific. And I hate to say it, I knew your mother and she would have been so proud. All I want to ask you is what next?
Ah, well. Excuse me. What next? Probably, I'm probably heading towards the environment and the landscape now. Yeah, I'm now very interested in the benefits. I've always felt the most interesting thing about Combermere, actually, well, the buildings are interesting, obviously, historically. The really special, powerful thing there is the landscape and the environment. To date, we know that our oldest tree is 810 years old. And we're doing a record this year. We're recording all the ancients this year, so we will have a proper record of them. And we've started to replant for the Queen's Green Canopy 2 years ago. We started replanting the ancient woodland as a woodland and not as a crop, which had been done in the 80s. But I think there is such power in landscape, and Combermere has a real power. And I think what we're seeing now, we hear about it more and more and more, people in green spaces, people benefiting,
People, and we hear this from our visitors all the time. We hear it from the guests. They just love the tranquility. They love the peace and quiet. They love the views. So I think it's going to be, I'm veering towards that.
May I ask you a question on that subject? How much public access is there to the park? And what is the wider setting of the house? Is it a big park?
The house, well, all the park is a farm now, so it's an organic farm. So people that principally have access are coming to stay with us, but we open for public tours 40 days a year, and we open the estate for very specific reasons during the year as well. But we have two, actually, quite luckily for me, far off public footpaths,
Right.
so they don't come in front of the front door. But special groups will come and do things. So we are as open to the public as I think we can be, having such an, I call it like a patchwork quilt of businesses. And, but we always welcome the public. We have groups coming.
You'll be building on what you
I'm building, yeah.
Anyone else like to ask a question? John Robinson.
Oh dear, this is difficult. I know it's going to be very important.
I just wanted to ask you about the obelisk on the other side of the lake. I've not seen it for 50 years, but as a child, we could climb up it and look out of the windows and down over the lake towards the house in the hollow. And is it in reasonable condition? Can one still climb up it inside?
You can climb up it, I wouldn't say that safely, but you can. Health and safety wouldn't want it. No, actually, we do padlock it because the locals sometimes think it's a fun thing to try and get up the top and have a bit of a drinking fest. Yeah. But the obelisk is still standing. It is in very good condition. It was left in the will of the last wife of the Viscount, first Viscount, that the family should erect a monument to his memory. Now, she died also at age 90. So she was, he died at 90. She was 30 years younger than him. And then she lived another 30 years. And then that was left in her will that they should erect that monument. But yeah, it's in pretty good nick. But unfortunately, we don't own the land around it anymore. Sorry?
It's a separate thing.
It sits, yeah, it's owned by the estate, but it sits in its own space. And it does have a public footpath up to it, so you can wander around.
Norman, I think, wants to ask something.
You mentioned, I think, enabling development, and by that, I presume getting planning permission where you might not ordinarily get it.
Yeah.
But for the fact that it was going to be applied, the proceeds applied to the house. How important was that, and how difficult was it to get it?
Oh. Well, it took 2 goes. And I would say, well, the first time it was, they told us we needed £2 million, which I couldn't sort of rustle up. So they then said the only way to do it was an enabling development. So at that point, we had a planning officer at Crewe, or East Cheshire, Crewe Nantwich he was, and he didn't like us. We spent 2 years putting all the plans together and a good idea, and he drove through the drive and he couldn't understand if you had a mile-long drive why you couldn't afford to do that. So that was our first barrier. And the second barrier were the neighbours, who told me I was going to be taking all this land out of agricultural use and blah, blah, blah. So that one failed. It went to appeal and it failed. So, but 2 weeks after it failed, the new head of planning came up to me at a tourism meeting and said, "Oh, I'm very sorry, you probably don't want to talk to me, but actually we need to talk to you. We'd like you to come back in because we have an obligation to help you repair a grade 1 listed building at risk." And we were one of the few grade 1 listed buildings in Cheshire, and we were certainly one of the very few on the at-risk register at the time. So we went back in, and they put some fairly onerous conditions on it, but we came back. Different team, different approach, another 7 years, and lots of bends along the way. And this time we had a very favourable council
And it was the development committee that stalled it. And then we finally got it on appeal again. But we were very lucky. We got the inspector who came to see us, discovered that he liked timber frame buildings. And he particularly liked the idea of scrabbling around in the top. I said to him, would you like to see the monastic hand beam roof? So on the way to the north wing, we scrabbled him around in the top. Didn't say anything, very formal. You're not allowed. And I said, do have a cup of coffee. And don't worry, I know you're allowed to have a cup of coffee. I'm not going to make sure, I'm not going to tell anybody because, you know, they're not allowed to have anything. They're not allowed to come and see, get some benefit of kind. Anyway, so we shook hands. We showed him the whole thing, shook hands. And as I was saying goodbye to him, I said, where are you off to now? He said, I'm going to Lancashire. I said, what are you going to do there? Oh, he said, there's a pub. It wants an extension to become a gastropub. But the village doesn't want it to happen because they saw a naked man running out of the pub once on a... And they think if the pub gets bigger, it's going to cause more problems. So yeah, it's been an interesting one. However, we got the money. And we got it 13 years after. We probably could have done with quite a bit more than 2 million, 2.5. But I worked again. We managed the job. My wonderful husband, who is definitely a frustrated architect and a very good project manager, took on, we were told absolutely categorically by the QS, you won't be able to afford this if you take on a big company. All your money will have gone in fees and, you know, all these other things. You've got to do it yourself. So I became the contractor. Peter became the project manager, and we bought all of the skills in. And we had a fantastic recommendation from our QS about a man who became our project manager, who bought us all the skills because he did historic restoration. So we managed the whole thing ourselves. And then I was very lucky. I had a dear friend in Nina Campbell, and she and I worked on the interiors. And she did all of the color schemes for the interiors and all her fabrics. I used them all in the project. But it's a B&B now, and it absolutely is adored by everybody that stays in it.
It's a terrific story in itself. Anyone else? In which case, I think I'm going to thank you.
Thank you.
Not only for answering this last minute call. Thank you, Dr. Also, telling the story, that last passage shows how important persistence was.
Yes.
But it's a wonderful story of decline, of ingenuity, persistence, and charm, I guess.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much.